Happy Sabbath. Last 2 weeks, we didn't study the book of Revelation. So today I'm going to make a few revisions. Revelation 15 to 18 builds on chapter 12 to 14. And the central theme of Revelation 12 is about Satan's effort to destroy God's people, living the time between Jesus' first coming and his return to the earth. You remember in chapter 12, there was a scene of a pregnant woman crying out with birthing pain, and then a big red dragon waiting to devour her child. And the woman is the church or God's people, and the big red dragon is Satan. And the women, later on it talks about, because of persecution, she flee into wilderness where she's nourished for 1260 days. And that is referring to the Middle Ages, when God's people were being persecuted by the papal power. And then it goes into Revelation 13 about the time of the end. And the chapter reviews the anger of the nations against God's faithful remnant. And Satan's forming a triune league, himself, the sea beast, and the earth beast. And that will they ally themselves with the world's political power to persecute God's people at the end time. And then the mark of the beast is enforced in a final conflict over worship. But God's loyal followers continue to be obedient despite persecution. And it comes to the beginning of Revelation 14, points to God's activities through his faithful children, the remnant, to warn the people of the world that the saving hope is in accepting the gospel. And the end of chapter 14 indicate preaching of the gospel has ended, and the intercession in heaven is concluded, and the destiny of every person is decided. And Christ is now about to put judgment upon the earth. In chapter 15 to 18, John elaborates upon the statement from Revelation 11:18, "Your wrath came." He described first the execution of divine vindication for the persecuted saints in pouring out the 7 bowl plagues on the followers and worshippers of the satanic trinity. And then in chapter 17-18, which we haven't studied yet, it goes into the judgment on the end time prostitute Babylon. So therefore, the last few chapters is about the conflict between the good and the evil. And God had created many opportunities for the world to repent. But at the end, many has hardened their heart, just like Pharaoh. Now God is answering the prayers of his people who has been harmed by the wicked, and has been asking God, how long before you vindicate us? The judgment is now poured out upon the earth, and the wicked will suffer. And the people of God, those who are sealed, are protected and will not suffer from the plague. The last time when we studied chapter 16, we ended in verse 16. But I'm just going to do a little recap of that verse. 16 says, "And they gather them together to the place which is in Hebrew called Armageddon." And we studied that Armageddon means mountain of Megiddo. And the mountain of Megiddo is Mount Carmel. In Old Testament, it is where Elijah, the prophet of God, and the prophet of Baal gather together to resolve the issue of who is the true God. And now we are brought to the very beginning of the battle of Armageddon. Verse 17. Then the seventh angel poured out his bowl upon the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne saying, "It is done." The last of the seven angels poured his bowl upon the air. At that moment, a loud voice issues out of the temple from God's throne, announcing, "It is done." So God's throne is located in the heavenly temple. The throne signifies God's rule and his sovereign authority over creation. In Revelation, his throne stands in opposition to the throne of Satan and the throne of the beast. And the fact that this loud voice comes from the throne of God suggests that it is God himself who is speaking. And this is the same voice in Revelation 16 verse 1, commissioned the seven angels to pour out their bowls. So what does this phrase, "it is done," means? Can we have better understanding of it? Well, in the New Testament, the pronouncement, "it is done," is made 3 times by Christ. The first time he cried, "It is done," it was on the cross of Calvary, announcing the victory over Satan. The second time is in this chapter 16. This same voice of Christ proclaimed, "It is done," indicates the conclusion of Earth's history. The third time, which is the last time, is in chapter 21, verse 6. And this time, "it is done," will proclaim after the millennium, which will be the final eradication of sin and the glorious beginning of God's everlasting kingdom. Verse 18. And there were flashes of lightning and sounds and peals of thunder. And there was a great earthquake occurred, such as has not been ever since human beings came upon the earth. So powerful was the great earthquake. The pronouncement, "it is done," is followed by flashes of lightning and sounds and peals of thunder. In Revelation, these phenomena are always associated with the throne of God. Let's go back to chapter 4, verse 5. You see, it says, "And from the throne proceed lightning, thundering." See, from God's throne, there proceed lightning and thundering. And again in chapter 8, verse 5, "Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and threw it to the earth. And there was noises, thundering, lightning, and earthquake." And again in chapter 11, verse 19, "Then the temple of God was opened in heaven, and the ark of his covenant was seen in his temple. And there were lightning, noises, thunderings, and earthquake, and great hail." Also, this verse says, "A severe earthquake, unlike ever before in history, occurred." Earthquakes in the Old Testament are regularly associated with the visitation of God's final judgment upon the earth, and are also referred to as the day of the Lord. So in verse 19, there's thundering and lightning and earthquake, indicating the judgment of God proceed from his throne. Verse 19. "The great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. Babylon the Great was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath." So who is Babylon the Great? Well, Babylon the Great symbolized a religious political power opposing God and oppressing his people. What about the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath? What does that mean? While Babylon the Great seduced all nations to drink the wine of fornication, which is apostasy. And as a result, God's judgment is upon her. The wrath of God, however, is not to be understood as a human emotion, but rather a metaphor for the inevitable reaction of God's holiness to sin and rebellion. And it is God's final response to those who have rebelliously and persistently resisted the gospel and disobeyed the commandments of God. And they also viciously oppress his faithful people. Well, a scholar named George E. Ladd states, he said, unless God in his wrath finally purges the world of all evil and rebellion, his kingdom cannot come. And furthermore, if God's judgment and his wrath doesn't come, we will never be rid of our suffering, and we will never be rid of the evilness of this world. Therefore, in the largest sense, God's redemptive purpose for man, his wrath is a necessary correlation to his love and mercy. Now let's go back to this earthquake. Well, this earthquake shatters Babylon and splitting it into 3 parts. End-time Babylon is made up of the union of the satanic trinity we mentioned earlier, and they ally themselves with the religious world power. Remember that, right? And the satanic trinity union now is shattered and is split into 3 parts: the dragon, the sea beast, and the earth beast. And the breakup of this end-time Babylon leads to the unavoidable collapse of the cities of the nations. While the nation discussed here denote the civil, the political, and secular world power that supported this end-time Babylon and had frustrated God's work on earth. Earlier in verse 12, it showed that these power had withdrawn their support from Babylon. And now these power that supported Babylon, they themselves collapse as well. And Babylon and those who identify themselves with it are about to experience the fullness of divine judgment. Thus, Babylon the Great is remembered before God. Babylon has to drink the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. And again in Revelation 18:5-6, it says God remembers Babylon's iniquities and punishes her with the cup which she has mixed, making a double portion for her. According to Revelation chapter 14, verse 10, all who worship the beast and his image and receive the mark are threatened and will also drink of this wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of his anger. Which it is saying is, God gives Babylon, who has made all nations drink of the wine of the passion of her immorality, to drink the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. And this same cup is also given to all who sided with her. Verse 20, and every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. Well, this earthquake is not the earthquake that was mentioned in chapter 6, verse 12. This earthquake of the 7th plague submerges all islands and mountains into the sea. And this earthquake shatters end-time Babylon. Verse 21. And huge hailstones, about 100 pounds each, came down from heaven upon man. And man blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, because its plague was extremely severe. Hailstones are often God's weapon of judgment in the Old Testament. The destructive hailstones of the 7th Egyptian plague devastated the land. If you go back and look in Exodus chapter 9, verse 24 to 25. So hailstones were God's weapon against also the 5 Amorite kings in the battle under Joshua. And more people were killed by the hailstone than by the sword. And this is in Joshua chapter 10, verse 11. And Ezekiel prophesied of God sending a torrential rain with hailstone, fire and brimstone against Gog and Magog. And this is in Ezekiel 38:22. And God also asked Job, "Have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I reserve for the time of distress, for the day of war and battle?" And this is in Job chapter 38, verse 22 to 23. And Isaiah and Ezekiel speak of a flooding rain and great hailstones, which God will send in judgment against the unfaithful. And this is in Isaiah 28:2, 30, Ezekiel 13, 10 to 14. So the passage here says, and huge hailstones, about 100 pounds each, came down from heaven upon man. And it is not clear whether these hailstones are literal or symbolic. In the Old Testament, as I mentioned, hailstones are used as judgment against Israel's enemy. And in the same way, these hailstones are used as weapon of judgment upon the enemies of God's end-time people. As with other plagues, these hailstones didn't change or do not change the wicked, who respond by cursing God and refusing to repent of their evil deeds. The plagues don't make anyone repent. Rather, they reveal what is in their rebellious hearts. Probation has closed, and intercession is no longer available, and it is impossible for even this extremely severe plague to change these people's attitude toward God and cause them to return to Him. In summary, the purpose of Revelation 15 and 16 is to reveal God's preordained plan for the triumph of His faithful ones. And the 7 last plagues are portrayed in Revelation as God's final response to the evil of the end-time Babylon in its attempt to destroy God's faithful people. And these chapters painted a vivid picture of the consequences the world will reap as a result of the abandonment of the law of God and His plan for human beings. And the violation of the divine law result in the destruction of the violators. Paul wrote, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, this he will also reap." This is in Galatians 6:7. So those who have been destroying the earth will experience their own destruction. However, although Revelation pictured the end as a series of terrifying events, but someone said that these events are in the control of one who cares deeply for the human race, one who loves the human race so much that He was willing to die for it. Happy Sabbath.